Hey everybody, we're gonna get started in just a minute. I know people are entering the chat room here, the webinar, and so I can see people still getting in here. We'll give everybody a minute to get settled, and then we'll get started right then. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Vonamy. I'm the Deputy Director with the DuPage County Stormwater Management Department, and we are here for a Lunch and Learn water quality outreach webinar where we will learn about the expected trends in weather patterns due to climate change and the expected impacts to natural areas, especially aquatic systems in the upper Midwest. We will also discuss concerns for future planning and restoration efforts of these systems with perspectives offered for ecological restoration and design professionals. This is a free webinar, and one professional development hour will be made available for your participation. We have several of these Lunch and Learn webinars throughout the year. We find they're a great way to connect like-minded individuals and organizations who are concerned about the water quality of our local lakes, rivers, and streams in and around DuPage County. These workshops are part of our public outreach and education programs and help us meet requirements outlined in our permit with the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency for MS4 communities. The webinar is being recorded, so if you know of others that couldn't be with us here this afternoon that might benefit from the information, we will provide a link to the recorded presentation shortly following the program. Before we begin, I just want to shout out a couple thank yous. Thanks, Raul Galvin. He's our Stormwater Outreach Coordinator, as well as Mary Beth Falsey. She is our Water Quality Supervisor. They set up the webinar and lined up our speaker for today. And speaking of our speaker, thanks to Vince Mosca. He is the Vice President and Senior Principal Ecologist at Hain Associates. Vince, thanks for being with us this afternoon and taking the time to share your knowledge with us about this issue. And once again, I'd like to thank all of you, our audience, for joining us this afternoon. Our presentation today, I know I said this, but it's going to involve the expected influences that climate change will have on our aquatic systems. And I just want to take make a couple quick comments regarding climate change. It's great to see that climate change is in the news a lot more nowadays. I guess you could say it's a hot topic worldwide. I know we haven't found an exact solution for climate change yet, but I think it's safe to say that we are definitely getting warmer, Personally, I've been trying to educate myself more on the topic. I've watched several documentaries recently, and one in particular that I enjoyed was called Ice Age 2, The Meltdown. Just an incredible storyline with fantastic scenic views throughout the program. It was so much better than the other boring, detailed scientific documentaries on global warming. Anyway, I obviously like to joke around a little bit. I don't mean to make light of the situation. I wish that people would take climate change more seriously. It would be cooler if we did. All right, enough of that. Before I turn things over to Vince, I just want to remind everyone that you are muted. If you do have comments or questions during the presentation, please type those directly in the chat box, and we will relay those on to Vince at the end of his presentation. All right, so let me formally introduce our speaker, Vince Mosca. Again, he is the Vice President and Senior Principal Ecologist at Hain Associates. Vince has been involved with thousands of wetland and ecological assessment projects over the past 34 years in northeastern Illinois and Wisconsin. Vince regularly leads regulatory efforts for both public and private sector projects. He has experience dealing with state and federal endangered species issues and with all aspects of ecological restoration, particularly wetlands and streams. Many of his recent projects relate to green infrastructure planning and design for stormwater quality and quantity management. He has given multiple presentations concerning modern approaches to water quality improvements for point and non-point sources, including discussions about costs related to design, operations, and maintenance. He graduated from Northland College with a Bachelor of Science degree in Biophysical Environmental Studies. He has a minor in chemistry, as well as a Master of Sciences in Ecosystem Studies from the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. So once again, Vince, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Raul, let's turn things over to Vince so he can start his presentation.
Okay. Thanks for the invite, folks. And those in the audience, I'm sure I know a few of you, and good afternoon. It's an interesting topic for me to discuss. It's I knew some things, obviously, about the ecology of Northern Illinois and water and precipitation patterns, but this has been a learning experience, especially since with the weather patterns the way they've been. We've all seen the crazy rainstorms and different kind of weather patterns we've had. So as I started to develop some of these programs, it was pretty enlightening for me to see the data and how it all kind of comes together, and then seeing it in the field and some of our restoration projects and the impacts to it, and even traditional gray infrastructure and flooding and damage as even we had sewer overflows this year with MWRD because of the way the weather patterns come. So it's definitely an issue, and it's not going away anytime soon. So one of the things about the trends, definitely things are getting warmer. There's an increase in annual precipitation that's expected. The rainfall intensity is a big issue. They're getting a lot more, rain is one thing, but rain in a couple hours of multiple inches is definitely a problem for many areas, especially in the built infrastructure. But at the same time, we're getting more rainfall, but we have higher evapotranspiration. So we actually lose more water on any given year. And one of the trends that everyone's seeing and predicting is that even though we're getting more rainfall, the extended rainfall that we're getting is actually going to be followed by drought, which is kind of a weird thing. So we might be getting wetter and drier all at the same time. So definitely the patterns and the mechanisms are all towards changes in the predictability of what sort of Mother Nature has gotten used to over the last 300, 400, 500 years. Where the prediction is we'll have wetter winters, so less snow and more rain in the spring, but then hotter summers. The nights are expected to get warmer, which means we'll lose phenolity changes, but also lose more water to evapotranspiration overnight, and even some of the heat island effects in the cities, the heavier rainfalls, and then the droughts. So that kind of combination of more water and then droughts is definitely going to influence how we do some projects. The trend is obvious. We've all heard on the popular press about all the hot, especially this summer. Phoenix is 30 days in a row or something like that, over 100. So the trend, we can say what we want about climate change and who causes it, but from a just a straight out data standpoint, the world's getting hotter, and that's just undeniable as a fact. We can argue about causes, but the trend is obvious that the world is getting warmer, and as many of us know, with the warmer weather and warmer water comes more rain, more intense hurricanes, tornadoes, and the like. So here's a prediction. You can see obviously the darker colors, the darker orange, and the reds are going to be higher temperature differences. So in eastern Wisconsin up into the UP and Minnesota, northern Michigan, they're expected to get roughly 4 to 5 degrees warmer in the next, in the 2041 to 2070. So not too far away. It's definitely going to get warmer than 20 years ago. Precipitation patterns, you can see the Midwest there with Lake Michigan, Illinois, obviously. Precipitation's going up in all seasons, including and many folks are involved in stormwater projects, you know, that the Bulletin 70 was updated several years ago to Bulletin 75 because the civil engineering and public works sector understood that rainfall was different and that our engineering standards for stormwater management had to be upgraded. So, you know, 4 or 5 inches more rain in a period is making the design storms higher and making the infrastructure needs, you know, to be increased to handle that precipitation. So precipitation may be spotty and in different places, but the trend is, you know, fairly significant in all seasons of the year. You can see that the trend from the early 1900s through the 2000s, that annual precipitation is just on the increase. And the trend is kind of undeniable that we're just going to get more water. Spring precipitation, which in some ways, as a wetland guy, I like that. But the problem is, depending on how much rain you get and when.
Looks like we're having some technical difficulties with Vince's computer. Just give us a second here while we try to get this thing started again. Sorry about this, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We're trying to get this issue resolved here as quickly as possible. You know, I know Vince was talking about how, you know, we're going to be seeing, you know, a lot more rain and then more times for drought. I know it was, you know, our spring was very dry this year up here in, you know, northeastern Illinois. It was very dry, March, April, and May. And then we actually had one of the wettest Julys that we've had on record. I think the paper said it was the 7th wettest July. So anyway, we're noticing that stuff kind of already, and I find it very interesting. You know, we're at DuPage County. We're in the business of operating flood control facilities and trying to alleviate flooding. So I don't sleep very well when it does rain because we have a group that needs to be checking elevations and operating facilities when that's required. So I actually loved the spring this year because it was a little drier. But again, I understand we need the rain, and July was pretty good. We didn't have to operate. We operated several facilities. I mean, it was like weekly that we were operating, but some of our major facilities still haven't operated yet this year. But it's just been a strange weather pattern this year. I can see there's a comment here. Rainfall tables have always been created by looking back in time. Perhaps we should be proactive and base the next ones on projected future rainfall. You know, I think that's a very good comment. You know, here at DuPage County, you know, when we do our watershed planning and project analysis and for several of our permits, you know, reviewing permits, we utilize a historical series of rainfall events. It extends back from 1949 through, we're trying to get that extended through 2019. So, you know, for our project design and watershed planning, we don't use design storms. We do use a historical series of rainfall events, and that historical series has shown that, yeah, you know, events are getting larger, they're getting more intense, but we include those events when we do the design of our projects and our watershed planning efforts.
Chris, I think Vince is back on.
Oh, okay.
I think we can unmute him. Or Vince, are you unmuted now?
I am. Sorry about that, and I'm not sure how I was supposed to know that. I apologize.
It's okay. Raul has pulled up your presentation, and he can run your slide deck if that's okay with you.
That'll be fine. I'm not, obviously you guys know where I stopped and I don't, so cue me up. I was saying some brilliant things to nobody. Is this where we ended up with the spring rains?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So the spring rains, you know, the interesting trend is going to be, we'll probably get more spring water, which from a wetland standpoint, and the wetland guy, I think that's a good thing, but the expectation is that they'll dry out faster. So even though we might get more water by, you know, middle to late spring, we may actually be drier than on a normal spring 20 years ago. Go ahead. Yeah. So obviously higher spring temperatures, the trend is pretty obvious. It's going to be warmer in the spring, which even though with the increased water, hotter temperatures, it may be less effective water, if that makes sense, because of the trend of the higher spring temperatures, which probably will have some influence on the phenology of plants and animal breeding and those kinds of things, because even though they're tied to photoperiod, they're also tied to temperature. Next. Extreme events definitely on the rise. It's the trends are obvious for a lot of these weather patterns, that we're getting more high intensity rains and shorter duration. It's very hard on infrastructure, both green and gray infrastructure. And with the increased rainfall and intensity, we're also very likely going to get more non-point source pollution from the farmland because of the high intensity storms that tend to move sediment or soil, significantly. Next. Drought. So we expect that even though we're getting more water, that the droughts, we may be this feast or famine kind of cycle, and then the stress on the plant communities, especially our wetlands, might be pretty significant on any given year. We had that drought earlier this year, and we got summer rains, so unpredictable weather is part of the system. But at the same time, if the trends that we had this June continued into July and August, it could really have a significant impact on some of our systems, especially the aquatic systems. And then with these trends of things drying out and lightning storms on some of these supercells, we may actually be experiencing Midwestern wildfires that we haven't seen really in a long time, other than around railroad tracks and stuff like that. So Hawaii's on fire, Canada's on fire, Siberia was on fire a couple of years ago. Just the expectation is that with these weather patterns changing, and especially on the drier periods, that it may very well cause some significant impacts due to fires in certain regions. Next. We all have our cell phones now with our weather apps, and we're all able to track these weather patterns and see if it's safe to go to a baseball game. But these pretty intense storms, as they track and train right along, you can see it's right there, it's hitting Chicago dead on right there at the state line and Lake Michigan. Just intense storms, and especially when they're 100 miles long or a couple 100 miles long, and training in one spot, it can really be a significant impact on rain, but then also lightning strikes and spawning tornadoes. Next. Supercells all over the place. We've all seen these, but they're becoming more common. There could be 5 different supercells at any one time in the region. And if you're Buffalo Grove in this situation, you're getting a lot of water in a short duration of time, and depending on the circumstances and how dry it was prior to that, it could be quite the event, whereas Lake Villa might have sunshine at that point. So these high intensity, short duration, and in one locality is becoming the trend, and it's really hard to deal with sometimes if you're that community. Next. Obviously what do they call it? The Corn Belt Derecho. A few years ago, when I pulled this up off the internet, just amazed by the pattern that was there, and it spans 5 or 6 states. One supercell after another, all training. This is that storm that knocked over all the cornfields and silos and barns out in Iowa and through the Midwest. It's just really intense storms. I'm sure there were probably derechos in the past, but the expectation is we're going to get more of these big training supercells into the future, which is going to have some definitely influence, especially on the built infrastructure. Next. Wisconsin got the famous tension zone. Some of you may be familiar. It's that lazy line from north of Eau Claire down through central Wisconsin to Milwaukee. It's the the transition between the northern forests and the southern prairies and savannas. Very well studied, very interesting ecology and research that was done to show that the expectation that if current trends continue with our weather patterns and definitely temperatures and winter temperatures, that the tension zone may actually move all the way to the Apostle Islands up in Lake Superior by the end of the century, which means essentially that Milwaukee and Chicago might have St. Louis weather by the end of the century, which obviously will have a significant influence on the ecology and even on human circumstance because of, you know, summer temperatures and humidity and the like. Next. So plant zones is not only going to be influencing gardening, but also the types of plants that we plant in our restorations. That the expectation is certainly that we'll be planting things from central Illinois in our restorations soon, whereas in the past we would, you know, the classic 150 miles from Chicago was our providence for plant and seed materials. We may actually be having to use central, maybe even southern Illinois plant stock here in the next couple decades because of the trends and the prediction that some of our species that might be on the edge of their range, currently southern end of their range, may move north and, you know, sort of maybe even disappear from our ecology. Next. So we expect that our small ephemeral wetlands and influence on amphibian breeding habitat are probably at risk. The small depressions that don't have very much in the way of tributary may be really at risk because they get water, but then it also dries out much faster. Coastal wetlands on the Great Lakes system, we all saw Lake Michigan levels a couple years ago that really beat the shoreline up. So if we get these really wet years and the water levels go up, those sensitive coastal wetlands may really be at risk, especially with the higher intense storms that we experience. Wooded wetlands expect to be flooded at some times, but if we get lots of rain in July and August, that could very well be very hard on them because those systems don't expect to be flooded in the summertime. They're much more of a, you know, predictable spring flooding and then dry out in the summertime. So there could be hard on them. And then farm wetlands, which are already edgy because of partial drainage and disturbance from the farming, those will probably be expected to be drier and probably will disappear at any kind of wetland function with our drier, hotter summers. Next. Urban wetlands. So the heat island effect, this is a picture of Milwaukee and the predictions for evening temperatures. So they're predicting that Milwaukee at 8 o'clock is going to be close to 90 degrees in the summertime, which is really hard on a lot of things, including humans. But if you're a small urban wetland and temperatures are into the, you know, mid 80s to high 80s during the evening, that's going to be tough to survive in any kind of functionality. And then, you know, the trend for urban green infrastructure is a good trend, but at the same time, we have to be cognizant that if we're trying to create rain gardens in the city, we better make sure that they have enough water and nutrition to make them run, because they could be susceptible to getting pretty scorched in a hot summer. Next. So more prolonged flooding, more droughts, and kind of unpredictable lengths and duration, or length and frequency. One thing about the higher intensity storms is the more non-point source pollution. So we're going to have warmer and saltier water because of the influence of road salt, which we'll touch on a little bit more. High flows from the extreme events. So you may have more base flow followed by less base flow in the same summer. Cold water species, which we don't have a lot of necessarily in this part of the world, won't fare very well because the summer temperatures will be much higher. If these trends continue, freshwater mussels and the good bugs that are in our creeks around here probably are going to have a hard time on some years and some periods because of the water chemistry and temperature. And then lake stratification effects, where some lakes that are maybe weakly stratified in the summertime today might not be able to stratify because the water will be too warm. Next. So, there's always good and bad to some of these, but the floodplain wetlands may actually expand, because if we do have more water and more flooding, it may actually increase floodplain wetlands because of the way the weather patterns are. And from a regulatory standpoint, that we may actually, gain some areas depending on the flooding patterns. Our disturbed systems, which we have quite a few of them around here, reed canary grass, Phragmites kind of wetlands, or cattail wetlands, probably just fine. But one thing to look at is that the resiliency planning to deal with climate change, a lot of discussion about using green infrastructure and wetland restoration as a part of stormwater management, water quality management, and biodiversity management may very well be a big part of future resiliency planning for multiple benefits, that sort of nature-based solutions that we like to talk about. Next. So interesting thing for me is just even in my career, just seeing things moving around. There's a plant called butterweed. If you guys are familiar with that, it's a species that I'd never seen before. Until it was in southern Wisconsin. It's a native genus Pachyra these days, but now it's showing up in Cook County quite a bit. And I had never seen it before. Real botanists may have seen it, but it's definitely on the rise, and it's native. But it was native to Bloomington South, and now it's here. So with the trend in weather patterns and the expected other climate change issues, some of our species, like the quaking aspen, which is more of a northern species, may not do well in the future. Paper birch, which is pretty restricted to Lake Michigan shoreline, just may not be able to handle the changes. Black cherry, more of a northern species. And then some of the ones that are expected to increase, sort of the, maybe we'll say weedy natives like silver maple, box elder, will probably be on the increase. But then things like black gum, hackberry, redbud, some of these, and then butterweed again, are expected to increase over time because of the patterns will be more conducive to their growth. And then there's the invaders. We have plenty of weeds in Chicagoland right now, but we'll be getting more from the south. And so the new invaders watch, we have to, we're not going to get kudzu next week, but at the same time, we certainly can get more weedy things, especially along the highway corridors that are coming from the south because of the changing weather patterns. So next. From a practitioner standpoint, so me coming mostly from the wetland side and a lot of my career, wetland delineations may very well be trickier because of the antecedent moisture conditions and unpredictable hydrology. If we have droughts in the middle of the summertime, makes sometimes harder patterns, predicting patterns and defining wetland boundaries. We have our numeric performance standards for hydrology, especially for things like mitigation banks, 23 consecutive days of water. That might be hard to meet because of the way the weather patterns are going. Probably going to have to change our seed mixes to favor some of the more southern species. And then the invaders from the south, both native and not native. Next. So another part of the aquatics mix is the effect on the lake. So we're definitely going to have warmer water, which is in the temperature shifts and thermocline. Those kinds of things are going to change. Length of stratification in the summertime, ice covered periods in the wintertime. Maybe we'll have less fish kills, but we also have more evaporation in the wintertime without without the ice cover. The lower water levels generally are hard on lakes, certainly from a lake use standpoint for humans. People don't like low water levels in July. Lower dissolved oxygen levels, which obviously has a biological influence. More salt Lower water levels tend to make more rooted plant growth, which tends to tick people off. We got our invaders again. Trends are definitely favoring harmful algae blooms, which can have an influence both on ecology and killing dogs when they drink the water, which is kind of a crazy trend. And then the non-source point solution also again. So next, please. So I thought this was an interesting statement from NALMS, the North American Lake Management Society. Specific ecological responses to climate change cannot be predicted because new combinations of native and non-native species will interact in novel situations. So you can figure out what that means, but they're basically saying things are going to happen and we're not quite sure what they're going to look like. So stay tuned. Next. This is an interesting thing from a science standpoint. I don't know a lot necessarily about nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon cycling in the world, other than sort of a peripheral look. But one of the interesting things about this is that when you look at using nature-based solutions for fighting climate change, there's been a lot of push towards preserving wetlands or restoring wetlands. But one of the issues with wetlands is they're kind of a blessing and a curse because wetland systems are a significant store of global soil carbon. You can see 30% of the world's soil carbon is in wetlands. However, they also burp. And so when they burp, next, please. One of the things, so the soil carbon, it's definitely the wetter soils store carbon better than traditional non-flooded soils in prairies and savannas and the like. However, wetlands do burp, and they burp things like carbon dioxide, which is kind of the #1 gas that we talk about from a greenhouse gas standpoint. But when wetlands are anoxic, when they're flooded and under anoxic conditions, they also burp methane, which is 32 times the equivalent of 1 molecule of carbon dioxide. And then one of the things that we really like to talk about wetlands for a functional value standpoint is that they denitrify. So if we have high nitrogen pollution from farm fields or wastewater treatment plants, push that into a wetland, it helps to, because of biochemistry trends, produces nitrogen oxide, but it's 263 times the equivalent of 1 carbon molecule or carbon dioxide molecule. So even though the wetlands are doing us a favor by transforming these materials into different things, they are actually maybe exacerbating greenhouse gas production, which is sort of an interesting dilemma, if you will, on where do you put your money on climate change resilience when it comes to natural areas, because wetlands do you a favor and then not necessarily. So next, please. So from a carbon standpoint, they are definitely king when it comes to it. You can see that from tons of carbon per hectare, wetlands are only 8% of the world's landscape, but a significant amount of carbon storage, which is good if that carbon stays there. If it gets farmed or used, peat production, those kinds of things, it's definitely the way to go when it comes to carbon as an entity itself. And then there is the emerging carbon credit market, which is still coming around, but it's probably going to be more important in the future. And wetlands will probably be part of that picture, including things like perennial farm crops, planting new trees, and the like. Next. Just to touch a little bit on Hackman Tech, which is the National Wildlife Refuge up in McHenry and Walworth County, McHenry County, Illinois, Walworth County, Wisconsin. I'm on their Friends board, but one of the things about Hackman Tech, it's a kind of a classic picture of talking about climate change resiliency and biodiversity protection. It's a nice local example of that. Next. Hackman Tech, you can see Hebron up there, Wonder Lake up into Bloomfield, just northwest of Richmond, up into Wisconsin. It's an approved wildlife refuge. We're celebrated over our 10 years now. And it's kind of a loose affiliation with the Nippersink Creek drainages, system of core areas and corridors, connecting some of the existing McHenry County Conservation District lands with some of the Wisconsin DNR, Ducks Unlimited, Land Conservancy of McHenry County lands, to protect some of these core areas for grassland bird and freshwater ecosystems. Next. Go ahead. Well, one of the things about Hackman Tech is that, long-term vision is to be, many thousands of acres, public and private, with these, connections of wetlands and grasslands throughout the Nippersink watershed drainage. Next. So here's the protected lands as of today. You can see that there's quite a few pieces of the puzzle that still need to be put together, but they are coming together. It's only willing sellers that come into the system, landowners that may want to, get out of farming or changing land uses that are being, put together with a bunch of different project partners. Next. One thing about being associated with Nippersink Creek, there's a lot of hydric soils in that corridor, which makes for good opportunities for wetland restoration. If anyone's been to Glacial Park, one of the jewels of the McHenry County Conservation District area land, you can see some wonderful restorations that have been stream and wetland restorations that have taken place there, and have really significantly increased functional value and water quality in the region. Next. You can see the network of all of the streams and lakes in the area. Next. You can see there's the branches of, so some of the corridor that has already been protected, all that green space, and then some of the areas that still need to be protected are the farmlands to the north there. So there's lots of pieces of the puzzle that still need to be brought in, but you can see that very natural creek corridor that comes out of northwestern McHenry County that's pretty significant biodiversity, especially freshwater mussels up there. Next. So one of the things about open space, as I've gotten older in my career path, one of the things that I've really become a big fan of is open space protection, especially riparian areas, because of the value for biodiversity, but water quality, and for people. There's many studies out now that show that, when people spend time outside, they're just happier people, less crime, happier adults, and we know that that's a good thing. The green infrastructure also helps with some of the urban flooding damages that we have been experiencing. But then also open space has been shown to really be a good real estate driver, because many of the people that have moved out into the suburbs through the years really like trails, nature viewing. I looked up, there's 166 miles of trails in the Forest Preserve, district of DuPage County. So that's, pretty significant. And Chicagoland's been very successful in getting people to voluntarily increase their taxes to promote open space and, these trail networks through the years. And it's really been a good driver for real estate and for just a better quality of life, which is really something. And then non-source point pollution is definitely an influence, a pretty negative influence on our waterways. So the more open space protection and sort of the removal of some of the riparian farmlands are really, pretty significant from a water quality benefit standpoint. Next. So we're talking about resiliency planning. One thing about these big open space areas, they're diverse. And so nothing wrong with the floodplain forest as from a protection standpoint. When you're talking about resiliency, long-term trends, hedging your bets on how the weather's going to behave. One thing about Hackman Tech is that there's over 350 feet of elevation change, so that if we do get wet weather, dry weather, depending on what we get, we'll always have habitats that are probably happier than they would be if they were, fairly only flat or of only one habitat type. So when you look at these big trends in open space protection, it's really nice to have the diverse habitats and bigger chunks of land that tend to just do better from a functional value standpoint when they're diverse. Next. So again, Hackman Tech is going to be more tolerant to these climate change than smaller reserves will be. The elevational diversity in the watershed is, 453 feet. Got those corridors along there. And then also from an ecological standpoint, that these bigger corridors will be a better sink source than a sink that for genetic material and biota when it comes to things like, genetic diversity. Next. 10 years in dreaming, the Hackman Tech is partner driven, and we do take donations. If you're ever interested, we do have some outings during the year. If you follow the homepage on Facebook and the Fish and Wildlife Services homepage for it. It's been very enjoyable for me to be involved in, and it's significant natural resource in the region. So how are we doing on time? It's 12:47. Should we go to questions?
Vince, we can. I was just kind of scanning through the chat. There was kind of more comments than questions at this time. If you have a couple more slides, or if you want to
yeah, I can just touch quickly on the Heritage Park project. Next, please. Next. So there's a project that we were involved in, which kind of pulls into a bunch of the topics we've been looking at. This is Buffalo Creek in Wheeling, northern Cook County. We were brought in, the project had been built and had been planted, but the contractors that were involved were having a heck of a time getting the plants to grow and staying in place. And we had been asked to come in and kind of do a truthing of it and value engineering to see what might be done. The contractor knew they were on the hook to get the project to work. However, they didn't want to just replant it the same as the spec had done originally. So they asked us to look over their shoulder and take a look at it, make some recommendations. Next. So this is, the drawing doesn't matter as much as there's a pump storage reservoir facility. It's in the black and white zone. The orange area is a relocated section of Buffalo Creek. So they kind of moved it out of the way and prettied it up a little bit to facilitate the flood control project. There, it's off of just east of Wolf Road, south of Dundee. For perspective, next. So here is the constructed channel with the grade control that you see in the stone. Ordinary high water mark is the edge of those floodplain terraces. There's stormwater from the recreational facilities that came in there, but you can see in 2014 it was pretty new and unvegetated, getting ready to be planted the first time. Next. So August 27 of 2013, you can see that it's been vegetated. They put up the infamous anti-herbivore control and the T-posts with the chicken wire on the channel itself. And so you can see that it actually greened up, and they were commencing with the plantings with the design that had been proposed. Next. Wintertime comes, as we know, things freeze, water expands, and you get flow. Next, please. And so as a part of that, now obviously it's part of a stream system. So we expect flooding. The design certainly anticipated flooding, but you can see that the herbivore control there lining the channel is completely surrounded by water in the wintertime. Next. And then with the spring floods and the ice damage, the T-posts started to get ripped out, and the chicken wire, it kind of became a bulldozer, and some of the plantings, most of the plantings that had been planted were ripped out because of the flowing water and the chicken wire. And you can see that those green floodplain terraces with cover crop are now bare. Next. Spring 2015, you can see all the goose footprints in the mud, and obviously in the springtime it's early, but it's also, you can see that the floodplains are basically just bare mud. All of the T-posts had basically been pulled out, so they removed them all. within that first year. And next, trying to figure out what it is. So this is next, please. So this is late July of that year. You can see that they did get some flooding, which is expected, but you can also see that by late July, you need some vegetation on your floodplains. So you can see that the prairie on the side slopes did pretty well, but the floodplains were in pretty rough shape, and obviously nothing growing in the channel. Next. So when we looked at it, we realized that they had planted the channel with emergent vegetation and even water lilies, but they had only used seed on the floodplain terraces. And we figured that that was probably a problem, because when you think about our stream systems around here, as modified and compromised they might be, if you have 24 square miles of watershed, most of our streams do not maintain emergent vegetation. So when we looked at it, also there's backwater effects from the Des Plaines River. So it actually holds water quite a bit, which is then hard on those plantings. So it's kind of like, when we looked at it, that they planted the channel with the live plants, they probably should have planted the floodplain. Next. So it also, during this vintage, was when northern Lake County up into Wisconsin got that 8 inches of rain in July of that one summer. O'Hare Airport was closed and the like. So it was not a good time to be trying to do these plantings. And so one of the things that was the influence was that the Des Plaines River came significantly up and then backwatered into the Buffalo Creek area, which then was kind of a double whammy. Next. So we had proposed then, forget about the channel plantings, since they probably long-term will never survive anyway. Go with hardier, lower diversity perennial plants on the floodplain. My favorite in these circumstances is prairie cordgrass, which has been pretty amazing on this project. Seeding with some common native stuff, simplify the planting plan, modify the management monitoring plan to include some lower diversity requirements, because diversity in these systems are probably less important than stability, in our opinion. Next. So spring of 2016, some of the restoration started to take place. You can see that we're already getting some significant growth on the floodplain. Next. This Plains River, jumping out of these storms. That side's probably out of place, but you can see that big significant jump overnight, basically, and then that long tail of submerged vegetation is not good for the system. Next. So July 2017, you can see that there's flooding from that storm. The channels down the middle there, and you can see that the terraces up to the yellow on the upland prairie is all flooded during that storm. Next. But a month later, you can see that the water's down into the channel, and look at the floodplain terraces, that green, that the prairie cordgrass was almost fertilized. It seemed by the floodwaters, and just really took to those terraces, and it really, significantly grew. Next. So you can see that there's, quite a bit of growth on there, and you can see that rock check dam we've been looking at, definitely made some progress for getting the perennials on the floodplain. Next. So these are all real pictures. That prairie cordgrass is 4.5 feet tall, over my waist kind of thing. And eventually those terraces were almost 100% with perennials in 2 years, which was just an amazing thing to watch. V3 did the plant. We redesigned it. V3 planted it, and I accused those guys of fertilizing it, with Miracle Grow or something, because they grew so well, and they promised me they didn't. But that's really a significant growth there, and we were really happy with the results, and really a functioning urban river system. Next. So that's all prairie cordgrass. So when you think about that river, that floodplain terrace there is just solid, almost impenetrable to walk through, which is really just amazing. So I'm standing in the prairie, taking the picture, looking up that corridor. Next. So, and you can see that the channel, which would have its ability to start naturalizing, if you will, in the actual true channel of the creek, has very little in the way of emergence, but the terraces are, you know, fully vegetated right up to the edge of the ordinary high water mark. Next. So there you go. So in 5 years, look at the difference in the vegetation quality. Just really quite the story. And what I think, and next one, please. One of the things to think about next. One of the things to think about from this standpoint is that when we're doing urban restorations, especially creek restorations, we often think about the creek and we think about fish and mussels and muskrats. I think that we have to worry more sometimes about the overall corridor and the functioning of the corridor, not necessarily just the water surface, because things like salt and hot water and erratic water may be harder to manage than the corridor of vegetation. So you get a lot of functional value with butterfly, pollinator habitat, bird habitat, people habitat on the corridor. And sometimes when we're designing these systems, we worry more about the water than we do the overall system. And I think that that's not necessarily the best approach completely. Next. So water quality issues definitely gonna, you know, prevent some of our vegetation from growing very well. But also we have to be realistic about the water quality trends in the future. We can do all kind of good restoration and green infrastructure projects, but we're still going to have a lot of road salt and other non-point source pollution coming in these systems that are going to be hard to deal with. Next. Yeah. Just be cautious as we go, and be open to the idea that the water surface isn't the only part of these systems, and that putting the whole system together, especially with the edges, the riparian edges, will make it all, I think, function better. So we're going to open up to comments or questions.
Sure, we have a couple of minutes here. First of all, thank you. Great job with your presentation. Very informative. There's many comments and a couple questions here. I'm going to have help kind of deciphering what this one is all about. I think it may be more related to drinking water, but it says, will LMO2 Lake Michigan water allocations be affected by changing weather patterns, like speed up groundwater transitions for AHJ to get on the LMO away from groundwater sources? Do you follow that at all, Vince?
That's out of my area of expertise. I think that the allocation for the city of Chicago with their 32 CFS or whatever they had, I think that's probably pretty stable. My insights from the industry is that since Lake Michigan's pretty predictable source of water and will be long-term, and there's probably, without overstating it, an endless supply of water in Lake Michigan, that if more western suburb, southern suburb communities go on to Lake Michigan water, that will overall be a good thing for groundwater, and that the rebound will be better if places like Aurora or Joliet go on to Lake Michigan water, because they'll be pulling out less water than they would have if they didn't get Lake Michigan water, is my understanding.
Okay, very good. Thank you. How about, do you think the FQI, the floral quality index values, will need to be updated similar to Bulletin 75?
Yes, I think that's valid. I think one of the things that will be probably, depending on how tight some of those ranges were, say, for example, butterweed, which is the plant I mentioned earlier, that kind of nice little wetland wet prairie plant, if that was considered non-native because it wasn't native to Chicagoland 150 years ago, we may need to update its status so that it's not considered a non-native species. So things like, you know, some of these southern species that they're moving into the area and for all practical purposes are now spontaneous and effectively native, we may have to increase, maybe not change the FQI per se, but the rankings of the individual species may have to be updated to reflect reality.
All right, very good. There was also a question, what sort of yearly maintenance is required with waterway vegetation?
Oftentimes not much, especially if there's no blockages. I mean, one of the things that, like all natural areas, some kind of management over time for either burning or winter mowing or something like that to remove some of the biomass. One of the things for the waterways is that the engineers don't like shrubs and trees down in the flow paths because they tend to, decrease the flow and maybe, flooding where you don't want it. So on an annual basis, there's always the classic weed management, maintain, keep Phragmites out. But long-term is probably more of the woody stuff growing down in the flow path that you want to prevent that from getting too thick.
All right, very good. I think we're about at the end here. There was one other question that I might ask Mary Beth to jump on here. It is, how is the county addressing climate change as required in the NPDES permit, phase 2 permit? Yeah. Mary Beth,
Sure.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I can talk about that from the county standpoint. Really, a lot of it is education outreach like we're doing today and just getting the word out about our changing climate. And then a lot back to what Vince mentioned is with our project sites, not only projects that we permit, but projects that we do ourselves, just, maintenance and monitoring, make sure the vegetation establishes that it's, correct for the hydrologic conditions and that we have healthy, successful native landscapes.
All right, cool. Great. Well, Vince, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for your very informative, interesting presentation. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us this afternoon. We know everyone's very busy, and we appreciate that you take the time with us to enjoy these webinars. We hope you all enjoyed and learned a few things from the webinar. Please remember that Raul will email everyone with a link to the presentation, a recording of the webinar, and that ever so important PDH certificate. Our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, October 12th, again at noon. Dan Bounds will discuss the storm sewer maintenance BMPs, best management practices, and registration information will follow shortly. So hope to see everybody there. Again, that's it. Thanks, Vince.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.